6 weeks after the wave, Yamana Soshin entered villages that no longer existed. By 1896, he was a Meiji-era industrialist and surveyor from Tono. He had studied surveying from the age of 13, and, at 28, had led 25 surveying teams. After the tsunami, he volunteered his services to the Iwate prefectural government as a disaster surveyor. He began in late July. The work took roughly 40 to 44 days. Traveling mostly on foot in straw sandals, with stretches by horse and small boat, he covered about 435 miles of broken coastline, mapped 168 villages across 41 settlements, and stood where houses had been, on ground where many of the residents were already gone. By the time the official numbers were assembled, nearly 22,000 people would be dead. But when Yamana began walking, the disaster was still not a number. It was a line on the hillsides. It ran along the slopes at varying heights, sometimes near the base, sometimes far above the rooftops of the villages that had stood there. It was the line where the water had stopped, marked by torn vegetation, displaced soil, and the residue the wave had left when it withdrew. Yamana measured it at every accessible site. Near Ryori Shirahama, his measurement reached approximately 125 feet up the gorge wall. At other inlets, the line sat lower. The variation itself told him something. The Sanriku shoreline is cut into a sequence of narrow, V-shaped inlets between mountain ridges, each opening to the Pacific at its mouth and tapering inland between vertical stone walls. Where Yamana found the highest watermarks, the inlet behind them was tightest. Where the marks were lower, the bay had been wider at the entrance. The wave had been amplified differently by the geography of each individual valley. In the villages, he interviewed the people who were still there. A man named Eikichi Ojida, in the town of Taro, described being caught between floating logs as the water came through, and learning, over the course of several minutes, to time his breathing with the brief outward draws between successive surges. Each backwash gave him a moment to take air before the next wave arrived. He had been moved by the water until eventually a surge had deposited him on a rocky outcrop where he was able to hold position. Ojida was the only member of his 10-person family Yamana found alive to speak with. In Kamaishi, Yamana recorded the account of Sergeant Asano of the local police. On the evening of June 15th, Asano had heard a heavy sound coming from the dark horizon and interpreted it through his training as cannon fire from a vessel in distress at sea. The signaling protocol for ships in trouble in 1896 involved sequential cannon shots, and every port officer on the coast knew it. Asano had begun organizing a rescue on the beach for sailors who, he assumed, were drowning offshore. The sound had been the leading edge of the wave already inside the bay. From 4 fishermen working off the coast at Omoe, Yamana collected an account that other survey workers had been reluctant to write down. The men had been steering through floating debris in the dark when they heard voices calling from the surface around them. Maritime tradition along the Sanriku coast held that drowned sailors, the Funa Yude, would call out to passing crews in order to draw them under, and the fishermen had hesitated in silence rather than answer. The hesitation broke when one of the voices identified itself as Yamazaki, the deputy mayor of a coastal town. The crew turned toward the sound and pulled survivors from the cold water. On a hillside above Miyako, Yamana noted a temple called Shinkoin. A group of children inside it had been kept indoors by their caretakers for the duration of an evening magic lantern show, an instruction issued for ordinary domestic reasons that had nothing to do with the wave. The neighborhoods between the temple and the harbor had been destroyed during the night. The children inside the temple had been alive at sunrise. Taken together, these accounts gave Yamana the timeline of the previous June. At 32 minutes past 7 on the evening of June 15th, the coast had felt a long, soft tremor that registered only 2 or 3 on the local seismic intensity scale. Lanterns had barely swayed. No structure had cracked. The rupture had occurred roughly 100 miles offshore, beneath the Japan Trench, in a slow displacement of soft ocean sediment that had absorbed the high-frequency shaking and transmitted the energy almost entirely upward into the water. Most coastal residents had returned to whatever they had been doing within minutes. Approximately 18 minutes later, the sea had begun to retreat. At Horiuchi, more than 1,100 feet of bare harbor floor had been exposed to the evening air. At Ryoshi and Oya, nearly 1,800 feet of seabed had emerged from the water. Several of Yamana's interviewees recalled people walking out onto the exposed bottom to look at it. The concept of a tsunami as a public warning sign did not yet exist along the coast in 1896, and the receding sea seemed to those watching it like a strange occurrence worth observing rather than fleeing. The wave itself had reached Miyako at 7 minutes past 8. By the time it entered the populated areas, it was carrying boulders, splintered timber, the wreckage of fishing boats, and dense ocean mud, along with the broken material of the buildings it had struck moments before. The first surge had withdrawn and returned as a second strike, denser than the first, which had caught many of the residents who had survived the initial impact and come back into the wreckage for relatives or possessions. Yamana had no instruments to measure forces. He measured what the forces had left behind. There was something else he documented, in the prefectural offices when he could reach them, which had less to do with the wave than with what had followed it. Within hours of impact, more than 22 miles of coastal telegraph wire had come down. Governor Hattori Ichizo of Iwate Prefecture, by professional background a trained seismologist and one of the founders of the Seismological Society of Japan, had understood with unusual precision what a wave of this scale meant for his coastline. He had also been unable to reach any of the affected communities or to dispatch coordinated relief because the lines connecting his office to the coast were no longer there. The first reports had reached the outside country only on the morning of June 16th, after survivors had crossed the mountain passes on foot to find a working line at Tono. Hattori's complete account had not arrived in Tokyo until roughly 36 hours after the wave. By the time Yamana finished his survey in early September, official sources had recorded approximately 9,000 destroyed homes. Iwate Prefecture alone had lost more than 18,000 of the roughly 76,000 people who had been living along the affected coast. Whole villages that had appeared in tax records before June 15th now appeared only as the absence of names previously listed. Yamana's report was more than a damage record. He documented casualties, destroyed houses, inundation lines, fishing villages, coastal work zones, and the practical question that mattered after the bodies were counted: where people should rebuild. He recommended moving homes to higher ground while keeping workspaces near the sea. He argued for coastal forests to absorb future waves and for systems of mutual aid between communities. He was not only recording what the tsunami had destroyed, he was trying to design a coast that would not die the same way twice. In 1903, Yamana donated his compiled records to the Imperial Library, the institution that would later become the National Diet Library of Japan. Decades later, in 1976, his granddaughter donated hundreds of his handwritten documents to the Tono Municipal Library. For much of the 20th century, the scientific value of his survey was overlooked. Then, beginning in the 1980s, disaster researchers returned to his records and realized that the precision of his data had few equals for its time. After the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, Yamana's recommendations no longer looked like old paperwork. They pointed to high-ground relocation, the separation of homes from coastal working zones, coastal forests, and historical inundation lines treated as warnings rather than memories. He had traveled the Sanriku coast in straw sandals in 1896. More than a century later, the coast was still catching up to what he had measured.